Hey friends, Brendan here. Welcome back to The Crawl. Today we're going to be talking about dungeon crawlers. Big surprise. But before we get to that, I do have one quick announcement that I want to share with everyone. So I already announced this on Twitter and in the Crawl Discord server, but for those who don't know, as of April 1st, I am now going to be a full-time associate editor at GameSpot. This is something I'm really excited about. I am so glad to be joining the team full time. For those who don't know, last 2 years I've been freelancing with them. I've been a freelance games journalist for about 5 years now, and then before that I did some stuff full time at Digital Trends. So this just feels like big next step in my career. I'm very excited for it. That probably brings up a lot of questions for people. The biggest one being, what happens to the crawl? And I'm happy to say the crawl's not going anywhere. I can keep doing the channel. I'll be focusing on dungeon crawlers and the type of content I already was doing. There will be some, changes and growing pains as I get used to this new schedule and whatnot. I'll talk more about that stuff at the end of the video. Point is, don't worry, crawl's not going anywhere. However, because things are going to be weird as I get used to this new schedule, there will be probably a gap in content. So I decided, instead of just doing an update video or going like weeks without uploading anything at all, I decided I was just going to come in here and talk about my personal dungeon crawler collection. I love watching videos like this from people like, Happy Console Gamer, Food for Dogs. My buddy Xeon does this a lot at Nintendo Life. So does my other friend Blade Blur. So, I just wanted to give it a shot. It's not a very big collection, so it won't be a huge video. But, it was just something that I thought would be fun to share with all of you and to, get some more dungeon crawler content up on the channel. Now, I should also note that this list isn't just like first-person DRPGs or Wizardry likes or things like that. It's a pretty broad list with including like dungeon crawling adjacent games like Souls-like games, Diablo-style action RPGs. We'll be covering a lot of that stuff today. And with that out of the way, let's get right into talking about my collection of dungeon crawlers. Starting with my oldest game in the collection, Wizardry V on the Super Nintendo. This is actually one of my most recent pickups. I got this at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo in 2023. Last year for GameSpot, I did a article like the best dungeon crawlers, of all time, or like the most important ones to get started with. I can't really remember what the title was, but anyway, point is, in that article, I only picked one Wizardry game, and Wizardry V was the one I picked simply because it retains that like old school, dungeon floor by dungeon floor design of the first early Wizardry games. It's got that DRPG setup, but it expands on stuff. This was the first game with D.W. Bradley, and he added in a lot of ideas that are really standard for dungeon crawler RPGs, like the thief being able to hide and then do an attack later, that sort of thing. That a lot of that stuff happened in Wizardry V. And it is a little bit more of an expansive game in terms of its scenario. There's a little bit more role-playing opportunity in some of the interactions and puzzles and whatnot, which I think is a really nice middle ground between what the rest of the series would do. Anyway, point is, Wizardry V is what I would point to as that's the Wizardry game to play if you've never played one before and you want to know the core of the series without going all the way back to the early ones. And that's kind of why it is the only Wizardry game in my collection so far. It just feels like the one that for me personally represents so much of what I like about the series. It might not be my absolute favorite in the series, but it is the one that I find the most holistic in its design decisions. So yeah. Also, it came with a manual, which is kind of interesting because normally it's got all the information about the game and the spells and whatnot, but there's no art. There's like 2 screenshots that just show a menu, which I think is kind of a bummer just because, how great the artwork in so many Wizardry games, especially those that were made or ported in Japan. And this was surprisingly enough done by Capcom of all places. So it's kind of a bummer there's no art in there, but it's still cool to have the manual nonetheless. Eventually, hopefully have a collecting box thing. I'm not really that kind of a collector, but still cool to have it. So the next generation of consoles, the Nintendo 64, the PS1, and the Sega Saturn. I was a Nintendo 64 kid, so I had, I played Zelda, Smash Brothers, and Rayman 2 and stuff like that. My friends all had PS1s, but I didn't really play PlayStation 1 games until like 10 years ago. And then for the Saturn, that's a console that I didn't really start playing until like 5 years ago. Mostly I've emulated most of the stuff, but I do own a few games, and most of the ones that I do own happen to be Japanese copies of old Sega dungeon crawler games on the Saturn. So first I will talk about Soul Hackers 1. This is the Shin Megami Tensei spin-off, Soul Hackers 1. The Japanese version of it never was released on the Saturn in English. Obviously it came to the DS as a English port. But this game is really cool. I really love the sci-fi vibe of this game. I love the mix of the dark occult themes with this sci-fi vibe. It's probably one of my favorite Shin Megami Tensei games, up there with like Strange Journey and SMT3. I really love it, and the manual's got such cool like screenshots and art in it, and it also came with this Shin Megami Tensei Japanese trading card. I looked it up. There's a whole Shin Megami Tensei trading card game out there. I haven't played it obviously, but I've got a card now because I picked this up at Portland Retro Gaming Expo. I think this was also something that I got last year. You'll hear that a lot in this video. But both discs in there, and it's a little bit scratched up, but I don't really mind. I'm really just looking to have something on the shelf to be like, hey, I like the game, I've played it. And that's part of why I get Japanese copies of games, is because a lot of this stuff is thousands of dollars. I mean, we all know that Panzer Dragoon Saga is like a $10,000 game. That is a game I have played, but it's because I've emulated it. It's easier to own the Japanese version of it than it is the US version. It's hundreds of dollars cheaper to own the Japanese version of it. Same goes for the next game, Shining the Holy Ark, which is a game I have talked about on this channel. I have a whole video dedicated to it and its similarities to Golden Sun, and why I think people should play it if they like the Golden Sun series. It's also just a good review just to know a little bit more about the game if you're into it. This version, it's just a simple jewel case. It's not like the US version with its big, glass box, or plastic box, I should say. Great art in the manual, and having something like this, a game that, is relatively new to me. I only played it a few years ago, but having it like in a physical copy like this, it's really exciting. It's fun. And plus it's a whole lot cheaper than, getting a $1,000 North American NTSC version. So if you want to have Shining the Holy Ark on your shelf, get a Japanese one. I think it cost me like $10. So those are the only Saturn games that I own that are dungeon crawlers. I do, however, also own one other piece of Saturn dungeon crawler memorabilia that I do want to point out. You might even be able to see it behind me. The glare is kind of weird. I'll put in a cool shot of it that isn't all covered in glare. But anyway, I have a poster of Baroque Saturn, which is my favorite version of Baroque. This was, once again, a Portland Retro Gaming Expo find. This was a few years ago. I got it. Finally got it up on the wall, like, only a few months ago. The frame is kind of cheap and not the greatest, but I'm just happy to have it up there. I love Baroque. I love the Saturn version specifically. I've played the Wii version, which I think is fine, but the atmosphere in the Saturn version and the PS1 version are so good. And recently both the Saturn and PS1 versions got English translations. I talked about it kind of in that big Dungeon Crawler 2023 roundup, but you should go check those out if you haven't played them. It's an older game, kind of clunky. There are some things that you'll have to get used to with the control scheme, whatever. But for me, I love that kind of stuff. And so if you like that sort of thing too, absolutely check it out if you have not played Baroque at all, especially. But if you played the PS2 or Wii versions and you want to see what the original was like, now you can if you don't speak Japanese. So the other console from that generation, we already touched on it a bit, the PS1. Man, I love the PS1. I think it's probably up there as one of the greatest consoles ever made. And I have barely scratched the surface on a lot of those games. Mostly what I've played are RPGs and specifically like dungeon crawlers and stuff. And some of my all-time favorite dungeon crawlers are from the PS1. And I feel very lucky in that I own all three of my favorite PS1 dungeon crawlers physically. It's the only system that I can say that about. So the three games we're about to talk about next, I'm very excited for. So we'll start off with something that probably won't surprise anyone. Now, I don't own a full like inbox version of it. I just own the CD, the game CD, and that's the US version of Kingsfield, which we all know is actually Kingsfield 2, but yes, the Kingsfield US. This is my favorite of the Kingsfield PS1 games. Kingsfield 4 is, for me, the ultimate of the series, but Kingsfield 2 captures a lot of what I love about Kingsfield 4, and it did it, years earlier on the PS1. This is one that I just had to own it. I haven't, played it in a PS1. I haven't done anything, but I just wanted to have it, and I am really glad that it's in my collection. Same thing also with the next game, which won't surprise anybody. I own on disc the original Shadow Tower 98 for PS1. This is such a cool game. I'm not going to go out and say it's the best game on the PS1 or anything, or the best dungeon crawler on the PS1 even, but it's the most interesting and unforgiving and uncompromising game I have played in a long time, especially from that generation. It totally swept me off my feet when I played it and covered it for the channel a couple years ago. I love how brutal this game is. I love the atmosphere. There's so much about its design decisions that I know a lot of people don't necessarily like, and that obviously go against mainstream game design philosophies to make games, more approachable for other people, which is something that, on a grand scheme, I think is an excellent idea. I think, that's something that if you want that for your game, you want that type of audience, I think that's a good thing. But when it comes to dungeon crawlers like this, man, this is my kind of game. And the weapon durability, the unforgiving difficulty, but also like the simplicity in the combat, and how boss encounters aren't really flashy. They're very somber and atmospheric, and almost more just like a way to give you dialogue and story about what's going on in the dungeon. It's a weird game, but it's really influenced not just what I like about games, like it didn't just change my taste in games, but also influenced like when I think about making my own games and that sort of thing. Shadow Tower is one of the biggest touchstones for me in terms of design. So yeah, I absolutely am glad that I own this. I'd love to have the full, box and whatnot one day, but just having the physical disc is the most important part to me. So yeah, glad it's in the collection. The last dungeon crawler that we're going to talk about for the PS1. Some people may quibble about whether it's a dungeon crawler or not. For me, it absolutely is. Another one that won't surprise a lot of people who know me, it's Vagrant Story. Now, I have the greatest hits version of it. I'd love to have the original 2-disc version, but this was actually one of the first PlayStation 1 games I ever played that wasn't Final Fantasy 7, 8, or 9, Tactics, or Metal Gear Solid 1. Like, those are all games that I played like through the PSN on the PSP years and years ago, and this was the first one that I really branched out and tried out, because I love tactics, right? And I loved Final Fantasy 12 at the time, and I wanted to see what else Matsuno had done, and I was shocked by this game. I don't think there are many RPGs, especially console RPGs, that have such a good story. Like, it's very contained and focused. It's very like personal and limited in its scope. You just have one character you're going through. It's almost like Metal Gear Solid set in Evil East. Not exactly, but I think that's a good approximation if you've never played it before. The battle system is bizarre. It's like a mix between real-time action and turn-based and strategy RPG. It's wild. I love it. I love the depth of the mechanics, both in the gameplay and in the crafting and in the build, like how you build your character and all the different, affinities for your weapons and weaknesses and all that stuff. I love mechanics heavy RPGs like that. And for a game like Vagrant Story to do, a mix of this mechanics heavy combat and stats and crafting on one hand, and mix it with cinematic, very personal, compelling storytelling on the other. And on top of that, it's got great level design. It's got amazing art direction. Like, this game looks like it was a PS2 game. The way that they are able to make a console, like squeeze everything out of a console and just do amazing art direction. The facial expressions and the textures and the animations for a PS1 game to achieve some of that, it was really exciting. It's not something that I think games need to have, right? I feel very strongly that games don't need to be cinematic in order to be good or tell a good story. But this game is cinematic, and it's good at it, and its story is good because of how cinematic it is. Vagrant Story is absolutely my favorite game on the PS1. I know that's going to shock some people. People are like, what about Final Fantasy VII? What about Final Fantasy Tactics? And I mean, Final Fantasy Tactics is my favorite game with the name Final Fantasy on it. But in terms of the PS1, and really, I mean, this is one of my favorite RPGs, period. I love this game so much. I couldn't have a collection without it, I think. This is like, we're talking like top 5 games, in case that wasn't clear. Something that I would have loved to do more of on the channel, and maybe I'll do it in the future. I don't know. But yeah, there's me finally talking about Vagrant Story on this channel. Okay, so those games bring us up to the next time period in my collection, which is the 6th generation. You know, the GameCube, the Xbox, and the PS2. And the Dreamcast, I guess you could include it in there too. These are... I mean, those 4 consoles and this era it's like my favorite era of video games. I know I said I started with the N64, but to me, I consider the 6th generation like where I really defined my personal taste in games, where I started to branch out and try different things. For me personally, like the GameCube is my favorite just because many of my favorite games are on there. But the PS2 is like right there. And so many great games. So we'll talk about the dungeon crawlers from this generation, because I have one for each console that we'll talk about. And in this case, these are games that 2 of them at least, are games that I've owned since I was a kid in some form or fashion. Unlike the last few, which have mostly been, you know, more traditional dungeon crawlers or action RPG dungeon crawlers. These are like really Diablo inspired games that are still dungeon crawlers, obviously, but they're you know, branching out a little bit outside of the traditional dungeon crawler lens. And the first one I want to talk about is my GameCube copy of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. Again, this is my collection. I mostly own games that I want to own and love, especially from this genre. So it probably is redundant for me to just be like, yeah, I love Crystal Chronicles, after talking about how many other games that I love so far already. But it's true. I love Crystal Chronicles, warts and all. I play this a lot with my younger brother. We had the link cables and stuff, and we did like a 2-player run of Crystal Chronicles. And at the time, I was obsessed with the idea of Final Fantasy XI. It would be years later that I would actually get to play it, but the idea of a multiplayer Final Fantasy just really captured my imagination. I was not like hugely invested in the Final Fantasy series. I had played it at some friends' houses. I was able to emulate some stuff. I was like, you know, like 10 or so, and I was like emulating games back then. But Crystal Chronicles, you know, it bridged a lot of those gaps. It was a Final Fantasy game on the GameCube, which we had at the time, and it was a multiplayer Final Fantasy adventure that I could go on. So in my mind, it was kind of like an ersatz Final Fantasy XI for me, of sorts. But on its own, in its own right, I really love this game. And a big reason is because of the atmosphere and the music and the setting. Those elements, you know, art direction, soundtrack, atmosphere, level design, setting, can carry a game for me even more than gameplay. I'm a gameplay sicko. I am the type of person who wants a bunch of different mechanics. I want things to be deep and crunchy, lots of friction. You know, I love stuff like Wizardry and Kingsfield for those reasons. And Crystal Chronicles is not that. Crystal Chronicles is a very simple game. It's kind of clunky and slow, but in not a interesting friction-y way, more just the UI is kind of weird, the control scheme's not the greatest. Nevertheless, I still find I go back to this game every so often, and you know, I think I've only beaten it like 2 or 3 times, but I'll play it again for a couple hours here and there all the time, especially now that it's, you know, there's that HD version on the Switch and whatnot. I know it's not the greatest version, but it's still Crystal Chronicles, and you can still be in that world, and that to me is the most important part. That music by Kumie Tanioka is so good. She also did a bunch of stuff for Final Fantasy XI, of course, and you know, a lot of her tracks there are some of my favorites. I don't know, this is so kind of a field of what Final Fantasy normally is. There's Moogles in it, there's a lot of similar enemies and whatnot. It's all about crystals, but it's such its own thing in that series, and I love it for that reason. Crystal Chronicles is not the only Final Fantasy game in my collection by a long shot. In fact, I almost included a few other ones. You know, I have my 3 favorites, which are 10, 11, 12, and I've got a bunch of like other random ones, spin-offs and mainline titles as well. But this is the only one that to me like felt appropriate to talk about in a dungeon crawling video, dungeon crawling collection overview, I guess. So the next one, Phantasy Star Online. This is a game that, you know, I have a project in the works that is about Phantasy Star Online that I've talked about before on this channel and on Twitter and elsewhere. I don't really know what's going to happen with that project in the near term future. Hopefully I'll be able to get back to it. There are some things about that project that I will have to adjust now given the nature of my new position. But I think it's fair to say, safe to assume that I will probably have some Phantasy Star Online content in the future. But anyway, for now, we can talk about it. And so I actually had the GameCube version when I played this version of it. And technically, I don't have it in the stack, but the first version of Phantasy Star Online that I owned and played, other than like the PC demo, was Phantasy Star Online Episode 3 of the Card Revolution, a card battling, deck battling game on the GameCube. I love that game. Amazing music. The card system, as much as people like didn't really want it at the time, it was ahead of its time, man. So much of what people would like about something like Slay the Spire or other deck builders is present in a game on the GameCube that no one played. But, you know, it was very different from this version. I feel like I'm going to repeat myself a lot in this, especially this specific section. But there's so much connective tissue about what I love about Crystal Chronicles and Phantasy Star Online. And again, it's the music, it's the atmosphere, it's the art direction. And man, so there was one summer where all I played that summer was Diablo 2, Phantasy Star Online, Crystal Chronicles, and watched Dohack, the anime Dohack. And to me, in my mind, that's what I thought all MMORPGs were going to be like, where these like, you know, these instance-based things where you meet up in a lobby, you go out with a few friends, and you do, you know, these quick missions where you're grinding against enemies, getting cool gear, that whole thing. And obviously that's not the case. Those kinds of games don't really exist anymore. You know, there's similarities to stuff like Warframe and Destiny, and I like those games, but there was something about the simplicity of this era. Again, like, you know, the combat's a little bit slower, and because it's kind of more limited, there's more tension and friction in the combat that comes from just simply positioning and timing your attacks that you don't get in something like Warframe or even, you know, new Phantasy Star games, especially like New Genesis. You know, it's similar. You were swapping weapons and had different loadouts in the original Phantasy Star Online, but man, the atmosphere and music and art direction, again, of this game has stuck with me my whole life. I think I've listened to Phantasy Star music more than most soundtracks out there, and there's just something special about this world. And, you know, I'm not going to sit here and be like, yeah, it's got a great story or whatever, but the world that that story takes place in just has captivated me my whole life. The sci-fi dungeon crawler that I've been working on off and on, so much of it is because of my love for this game, for Phantasy Star Online. So the interesting thing about me and Phantasy Star Online is that I didn't actually play it on the servers. I played it couch co-op on GameCube, and all my online experience with the game has been through the Blueburst servers, specifically Affinia, which I still play pretty regularly, actually. So yeah, despite the fact that I never had the like classic online experience with Phantasy Star Online, nevertheless, it's one of my favorite games. I love so much about it. It's another one that really defined a lot of what I like just in general, not just about games, but about media overall. You know, I really love, you know, sci-fi, but specifically like science fantasy, that weird blend between science fiction and fantasy that you get from Phantasy Star Online. You get that from some of the Final Fantasy games. You get it from, you know, Dune and Star Wars and all that sort of thing. That really is, for me, like my favorite kind of setting is the, you know, where you got laser swords and magic, and you have spaceships and like eldritch gods from other dimensions and that sort of thing. I love that stuff. So kind of like what I was talking about with Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. But with Phantasy Star Online, this is not the only Phantasy Star game that I own. I have, like I said, I have Card Revolution, Episode 3. I have North American and Japanese versions of Phantasy Star 4, which is like one of my favorite 16-bit RPGs ever made. I got Phantasy Star 2, Phantasy Star Nova, Phantasy Star 0, and then on top of that, like a bunch of art books and stuff. It's a collection that is in progress, but it is certainly the series, one of the few series that I am like actively collecting for. Because yeah, Phantasy Star is really important to me. I love it. I love the whole series, both the online and the offline games, the original RPGs. And yeah, so this one is another one that's super special to me. Again, the 6th generation action RPGs we're talking about, very special to me. So earlier I mentioned that there was one summer where I played Phantasy Star Online, Crystal Chronicles, and Diablo 2, and was watching the Dohack anime. And so like to me that defined what I thought of as MMO RPGs and online games in general. But it's interesting to note that like up until literally last year, I had not played any of the Dohack games. And when I was getting into the series, I was trying to decide, like, am I going to play the GU games? Am I going to play the IMOC games? I watched a bunch of, videos about them. I watched my buddy Super Rad's stuff. I really wanted to know, like, a bunch about the series. And what I ended up finding out was that there was a Japan-only MMORPG that never got an English translation but has a fan patch and active fan servers, which is like the most Brendan-ass description for a game I can think of. So recently I went and picked it up. It's called Dohack Fragment. It takes place after the IMOQ games. Well, not after, it's like an online version of that gameplay engine with some differences. Like you don't have a pause menu to do your abilities, you just do them actively. But we won't get into the nitty gritty of all that. The reason I picked up this game specifically is because I didn't want to go through all of the IMOQ games. I just didn't have the time, but I wanted to try out one of the games. And so I played this via an emulator and thought it was so cool. The atmosphere, I mean, again, just like the other two games from this generation, the atmosphere, the art direction, the like limitations of the graphics and whatnot, let your imagination fill it in, but still have enough detail to, have some really cool set pieces and cool moments. I remember there was like the first time I was wandering a field looking for the dungeon in one mission, and I looked up and there's like, that undead mummy spaceship thing. It blew my mind. This game is so cool. I didn't go through the whole thing. I don't know if I ever will. I would like to play through the IMOQ games at this point. This solidified that, like, as much as I think Fragment is cool, and I've played a little bit of both the offline and online versions of it, I would like to go through the actual IMOQ series at some point in the future. But yeah, this was my first stepping stone into it. And then I got the physical, I was gifted the physical version of it by my buddy Xeon at the most recent Portland Retro Gaming Expo. And yeah, I mean, like, anytime I'm going to play the game in the future, I'm going to play it on an emulator with the fan translation. But I really just wanted to have a Dohack game on my shelf, and Xeon knew that and very graciously gifted me this. So, it's not a game I grew up with. It's not a series really I even grew up with, but there is a lot of sentimental value attached to it just because of how I got this game and how it represents my entry into the gameplay side of the series. Okay, so before we move on to the 7th generation of consoles, I do have a few handheld games I want to talk about. Now we're going to get back to some more traditional dungeon crawlery things. But first, we just talked about Phantasy Star Online. I do really quickly want to bring up Phantasy Star 0. This is the Japanese version of it. Again, about, I would say, a good third to half of the games that I own physically now are Japanese versions or Japan-only games even. Phantasy Star 0 is a game that I think is very neat. I think the fact that they went back, this was during the time where like the Phantasy Star Universe games and the Phantasy Star Portable games, which are spin-offs of Universe, those were ongoing. And this is kind of a return to Phantasy Star Online, but with a more, I would almost say like a shonen-esque anime art style and even storyline to an extent. and it has more of a bespoke storyline than the original Phantasy Star Online did, but you can play it more readily single player. There was offline, or I should say ad hoc multiplayer and Wi-Fi based multiplayer actually. It is a little bit simpler in gameplay and certainly in graphic style than the standard Phantasy Star Online games. But I was still shocked with how well it made the transition from like a Dreamcast, GameCube, Xbox One or original Xbox game to being a DS reimagining of some of those gameplay ideas. I once heard that it's almost like if Phantasy Star Online was a Saturn game, like graphically and in the sound effects and whatnot, just because the DS was a more limited hardware. But I think it's definitely a neat game. I'm glad I own it. I think I picked this up for like $3 or $4, which is nice because it came with the full manual and a bunch of like online like codes for redeeming stuff that you can no longer redeem or anything. But I love Phantasy Star, so it's nice to have a physical edition of a game that I probably wouldn't have owned otherwise. So the next DS game that I want to talk about is, man, it's a classic. It's the original Atrian Odyssey. I've gone on record on this channel multiple times saying that Atrian Odyssey is my favorite Wizardry-like dungeon RPG series, and I still stand by that to this day. I love these games. So I actually discovered Atrian Odyssey with the 4th game on 3DS. It was right around the time where I really discovered dungeon RPGs overall. I had just beaten the Dark Spire, the DS game, the Dark Spire, and I was looking for something else like it. So I picked up Atrian Odyssey 4. And since then, I've played all of the Atrian Odyssey games, but I've only owned them digitally. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I picked up the original. This case was a gift again from my buddy Xeon, and got the game shortly after. Now, this is a series that I would love to have like the full collection of at some point. It's not necessarily something that like I'm actively working to get all of them. There are other things maybe higher on my priority list, but just having this version of it is exciting to me. It's in a really nice shape too. Atrian Odyssey holds a special place in my heart just because it was one of the first games of that series that I got into. And it's funny because like thinking back with how I felt at the time, like I didn't actually really like the art style all that much, and I was way more into stuff like the Dark Spire, which is more like this gritty comic booky, very much wizardry inspired, and this was more, some would say, like a Japanese RPG style. Over the years I have come to really love the art style and kind of prefer the aesthetic of Atrian Odyssey over the more like dark Western fantasy stuff. I've talked about that before on the channel. But anyway, part of the reason I haven't really gotten into collecting the other Atrian Odyssey games is because they're expensive. But now that the HD Origins versions of 1 through 3 are available on the Switch and on Steam, I'm hoping that, prices will maybe even out a little bit. DS stuff is really popular anyway. But even if this is the only Atrian Odyssey I ever own physically, I'm glad it's the original first game on DS. Now, since we're talking about DS games, and I did mention the Dark Spire, unfortunately, I don't own that game physically. I never have. I actually, I emulated it the first time I played it all those years ago. And ever since then, I have been looking for a copy of it, but man, that game is expensive. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is because right around the time that I did play it, I almost picked up a copy of it on like Amazon. Like it was a used copy of it for like $20, like 15 or $20. And I almost did it and I never did. And now that game goes for like $170 sometimes. And I just, I can't make the, justification to buy a game for that much, but, maybe one day. Okay, so we're getting down to the last few games in my Dungeon Crawler collection that I'll be showing off today. And the next one is one that is, again, another really special game to me. And that is Shearan the Wanderer 5, the Tower of Fortune and the Dice of Fate. This was the first Shearan game I ever played. I read Jeremy Parish's review on US Gamer, however many years ago that was, and it immediately intrigued me from the way he described the game. I had been a fan of roguelikes, like, Dungeons of Dreadmore, Caves of Cud, and I had played a game, kind of similar to that. One of my first like professional video game reviews was Brandish on the PSP and Vita, which is not a mystery dungeon or a roguelike, but it is a pretty difficult grid-based top-down dungeon crawler with active combat, kind of like a mystery dungeon game. I have been looking for more games like that, and this absolutely fit the bill. And ever since then, like, I hadn't played a mystery dungeon game before Shearan, and ever since then, it is my favorite rogue-ish inspired series of all of them. There are games out there. I already mentioned Caves of Cud, which is a phenomenal game, but like when it comes to just the pickup and playability of Shearan and most mystery dungeons in general, these are like the arcade games of dungeon crawlers to me, and roguelikes in general. Like just being able to do these dungeons quickly and in a breezy way, and you have these these really charming, cute graphics and these really whimsical soundtracks that are, propelling you through. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I love Shearan. Shearan the Wanderer 5. I've gone back and I played the translation of 2. I've played the Game Boy game, and I've played some other mystery dungeon games like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon and some of the Toho mystery dungeons. And the one that still, I maybe it's just because it was my first, but there's something about Shearan 5 that really stuck with me. And I actually have played Shearan 6. NIS actually sent me a code for it, and I was hoping to review it, but because of a bunch of stuff, including the interview process for the new job that I'm starting this month, it just didn't happen yet. It is something that could potentially happen, and I will say that Shearan 6 is maybe a better package overall, but yeah, still doesn't quite top Shearan 5 for me. And I think a lot of that's just because of the nostalgia and the sentimental value attached with this game. But you should absolutely play Shearan 6. Like, don't even wait for my review. Just go play it. It's incredible. If I wasn't completely addicted to Dragon's Dogma 2 right now, I would probably just be grinding through Shearan 6 over and over and over again. Before we do the last batch of games, which will encapsulate several consoles and generations, I did really quickly just want to bring up, it's debatable how much of a dungeon crawler people would consider it. I consider Persona 5 a dungeon crawler. But yeah, this is the original Persona 5 on PS4. I don't have the Royal version, and in fact, I haven't beaten Royal. I probably never will. That game's really long, and I had already gone through this version, and I got through like most, I think it was like in the last like probably 10% of Royal. But anyway, the point is, I just want to bring it up because as much as I am a mainline SMT guy, I started with Digital Devil Saga on PS2. I rented that back in the day, and then played like SMT 3 and Nocturne and 4 and all these other games. I definitely prefer that, but Persona 5 is still an important game. I really enjoy the combat and the style and the vibe of this game. I think Persona 2 and 3 are my personal favorites, and I think over the years my opinion on Persona 5 has kind of gone up and down and changed a lot, but nevertheless, I own it. It is a dungeon crawler in my opinion. If you want to try out a dungeon crawler, but you prefer to have a story, you prefer to have characters, a lot of things that really hardcore, especially Wizardry or Atrian style dungeon crawlers just don't really have, I think this is a great series for that. So I really appreciate the fact that, it allows people to have characters and storylines to get attached to carry them through the dungeon crawling. 5 takes more of a it's like a bespoke, almost Zelda-like approach to its dungeons, as opposed to the more like traditional almost grid-based style of the earlier Persona games. Nevertheless, absolutely included in my dungeon crawler collection, and again, I respect it a lot. I do really like this game. And I do like Persona. I feel like this maybe sounded a lot more negative, but there is a reason why Persona 5 is in my collection. It's a good game, and if for any reason, like all the other games in this list sound too intimidating or are just not your thing, but you want to try out a dungeon crawler, Persona, the whole series, and specifically Persona 5 is the one to probably try out first. Okay, so we've made it to what is going to be the last section of this collection show and tell episode. There's a lot of games I could have included in this list. I own a box copy of Morrowind. I own copies of, Final Fantasy 11. There's stuff like, Grand Knight's History on the PSP. A lot of stuff that is like dungeon crawler adjacent that could have been on this list. But if there are any dungeon crawling adjacent games that I feel deserve to be covered in a video overviewing my dungeon crawler collection, it's the Souls games. So I own not all of the FromSoft Soulsborne series, but I do have the entirety of Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and I own the collector editions, steelbook editions of them. So first we'll talk about Dark Souls. This is the version of Dark Souls I got back in October 2020 or 2011, excuse me. And man, this is one of the few copies or a few 360 games that I own originally. I'm get this open. So this is one of the few 360 games that I owned at the time that I still have. I ended up actually having to sell and trade in all of my 360 games to pay for rent one year. And this was one of the few that I kept because, at the time it was my favorite game of all time. It's still in the running though. Absolutely, I still think it's my favorite of the Dark Souls, of the Souls trilogy, is the original Dark Souls. I think it's a phenomenal game. I love the world design, the combat, the art direction of this game it blew my mind back in 2011, and to this day, I still think it holds up so well. And yeah, the game's interconnected level design, almost Metroidvania-ish. It's why I prefer it to almost every other game that FromSoft has made, especially in the Soulsborne series, or family genre, whatever you want to call it. I will probably hold on to this for as long as I have a video game collection. This is one of my favorite things that I have. There's also it comes with an art book and stuff that I've flipped through a million times. It's on my shelf over there. But yeah, Dark Souls 1, I love this game. And then of course there's Dark Souls 2, which I have the Steelbook edition. And this is one of the few PS3 games from that era, that generation, that I still own because after I had traded in my 360, it was a few years, I think it was a year later, I picked up a PlayStation 3. And this is, of course, one of the few games from that time that I still own. I never ended up picking up that many PS3 games, but this is one I just could not pass up. I was so excited for Dark Souls 2. And at the time, I did have conflicting opinions on it. I think a lot of people did. There were things about Dark Souls 1 that I was hoping would continue over to Dark Souls 2, the level design being one of the big ones. And so at the time, I was really mixed on it. I still loved the game from a combat and atmosphere perspective, but it was missing things that I loved about Demon Souls and Dark Souls. Interestingly enough, I actually went back and replayed this game via the version in this collection, which is the Dark Souls Steelbook Trilogy collection. I really changed my opinion a lot. I wouldn't say that I hated Dark Souls 2 before, but now I've come to really, really like Dark Souls 2 in a way I never did before, replaying it last December. I did a whole podcast with my friends at the Daydreamcast where we talked about that. It was just published a couple weeks ago, in fact. So if you want to hear more about me and my thoughts on Dark Souls 2 and the journey I went on with the recent replay, definitely go check that out. Even if I hadn't changed my mind on that game, though, I would still keep this because Dark Souls as a series, that trilogy is so important to me. And then so I also have the Dark Souls Trilogy Steelbook collection, which has all three games, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, PS4 versions of it here, which you may have noticed means I don't own a standalone physical copy of Dark Souls 3. And the reason for that is at the time I was just not buying physical games, and so I got that one digitally. But that's the one that I'm the least concerned with owning physically. I think one day I would like to try and track down like a Steelbook edition, but Dark Souls 3 is actually my least favorite of the three, especially now after my recent replay of 2. I think a lot of people will take issue with that because, for them, Dark Souls is a combat game first and foremost, and I will, concede that in terms of the depth and breadth and scope of what you can do with Dark Souls 3's combat and the weapons, the animations, the skill ceiling of that game is much higher, much more interesting, much more rewarding than what you get in Dark Souls 1 and 2 and Demon Souls especially. But for me, Dark Souls and Demon Souls, they're exploration games, they're resource management games, they're dungeon crawlers first and foremost. And as I was saying earlier with some other games, it doesn't bother me if combat is, a little bit more simplistic or slower paced, or if the majority of challenge doesn't just come from combat encounters, which is how I feel about Dark Souls 1 especially, and Dark Souls 2. There's a lot of friction and mystery and puzzle solving just in the simple mechanics and navigation of these games that I felt was missing from Dark Souls 3. I'm not going to sit here and just rag on Dark Souls 3 because it is a great game. It absolutely is. I've still beaten it like 3 times. I don't think it's a bad game. It's just of the 3 Dark Souls games, it is, lowest on my preferred list. That's all. And so you're probably wondering, okay, so where does Demon's Souls fit in there? And actually, I would say that Demon's Souls fits in right under Dark Souls for me in terms of these 4 games. I really adore Demon's Souls. I love how weird that game's systems are. I was singing the praises of Shadow Tower and King's Field 2 not that long ago, and now here I am saying that, I like world tendency. I prefer the fact that there's weapon durability. If you watched my Elden Ring video, you know some of how I feel about this stuff. I really look for challenge in places that aren't just combat, and I look for, mystery and atmosphere in places like, level design and mechanics and whatnot. So unfortunately, I don't own Demon's Souls, but I do own the Demon's Souls remake on PS5. It's one of 2 physical PS5 games that I own, the other one being Final Fantasy 16. Just because, I like the PS5, but there's not a lot of games on there. And the ones that I do have, it's just easier to own them digitally at this point. But this one's kind of a contested point, a divisive point among fans as well. I know there are people out there who have valid and appropriate concerns about some of the changes in art direction that Bluepoint, some of the liberties Bluepoint took with the art direction and even the lore of Demon's Souls in this remake. And as much as I agree with a lot of those, I still think that this is the version I like best because it's so pretty. I hate to say that because I'm not really a graphics guy. Graphics are not very high on my personal checklist of what makes a game playable or good or whatever. But I don't know, man. There's just something about the atmosphere of this game that it is different than the original Demon's Souls, and people are free to, discard my opinion, whatever. I don't really care. I'm gonna speak my truth. I think this version's good. The core gameplay, which is the part that I am the most particular over, and the part that I wanted to have be maintained the most, to me, it is completely intact. It still plays and feels like Demon's Souls in the moment to moment gameplay, in the mechanics. There are some differences, but the differences are ones that I either, think are equal to or even better than the original. If I'm going to own a copy of Demon's Souls, it might as well be this one. I would like to own the PS3 version. And don't get me wrong, I think the PS3 version is absolutely, totally amazing. And I would play it for reasons besides the reasons I played the Demon's Souls PS5 version. This is just the most readily available to me. So it's the one that I've played through the most recently, and I think probably put the most time into overall. But yeah, these 4 games, the Souls games, they got me back into video games. I'm going to be very honest. back in 2011, I really wasn't playing games that much. I was, early in college at that time. And, there were games that I definitely played. I was still following them. I was still actually technically in school to like go do like video game media. It was what I wanted to ultimately do, but I really wasn't playing a lot of games at the time. I played like Skyrim and Metroid Prime 3, Brutal Legend. Like I'm like trying to think of games from that era that I was really like interested in, but a lot of them just didn't do it for me. I think that era, the PS3 and 360 era, and I guess the Wii as well, the prevailing like design philosophy of that time just didn't really click with me, which is kind of continued on into like the PS4 and even the PS5, Xbox Series X generations that we're in now, of these very cinematic single player experiences that are really trying to appeal to a wide audience. And there is nothing wrong with that. I really want to be clear that I don't want to be a gatekeeper. I think that anyone can like whatever they like. Games can be a vast variety of things. It's just that at the time, especially in the PS3 generation, that's what everything was. There wasn't a lot of games that were like the games I loved growing up. And even the games that I liked growing up, I'd kind of grown out of them to a degree. And so I really just wasn't playing very much stuff towards the latter half of high school and into college. And then Demon's Souls came out, and while I didn't own it, it really fascinated me. So when Dark Souls came out a couple of years later, I picked it up kind of on a whim, just because I was like, well, Demon's Souls was cool. I want to try this one out. And it completely changed my life. It's kind of a hyperbolic thing to say, but like it absolutely did. It was everything that I was looking for games to be, and then some. It did things that I didn't even know I wanted from a video game at that time. So I really appreciate it and what it did for me. And it introduced me to stuff like the Dark Spire, which led to, Atrian Odyssey, which led to checking out, stuff like Vagrant Story and all these other games. And like almost all of the games that I've talked about here, with the exception of the couple that I had growing up, almost all of them I own because I got Dark Souls and I fell so in love with this game and the rest of the series. And so, that's why I was going to end with that. Plus, it's the collector's edition. They're all nice and shiny metal and whatnot. And this is a good kind of like crown jewel of my collection, which compared to a lot of people's collection, it's probably like, dude, 3 metal box copies of Dark Souls. Really? That's your big, that's like your big centerpiece, but it is. And, I love these games, and I'm happy to have them on the shelf in this, collector's edition form. I don't feel that way about really many other games. Basically, it's like these, Monster Hunter, Metroid, and Zelda. Those are kind of like the 4 series that I really will show up for. So anyway, that is my dungeon crawler and dungeon crawler-ish collection. I have several other games, plenty of other stuff that maybe, in the future we could talk about. Because as I said, starting this new job, it's going to have some changes to the way that I will do content on this channel. Not necessarily because of what I'm allowed to do. There is a little bit of that, but also just the time. Being a freelancer, you do have long stretches of free time, which is why I was able to do some of those bigger projects. However, those stretches of free time are pretty infrequent. They're hard to plan for, and they're usually bookended by long, really arduous stretches of just grinding through a lot of work. And now, being in a more consistent, 9 to 5 every, weekday schedule, it will take some adjustment for, me mentally, but it could open up potentially the ability to do things more consistently on this channel, which was a goal of mine in 2024 regardless. I originally wanted to have 1 video out a month this year, and it started out well with the Dungeon Crawler Roundup in January. Unfortunately, in February, our cat was diagnosed with cancer, and he passed away a few weeks ago. And then through March, I was dealing with the interview hiring process for this new job. And then in April, of course, we'll be figuring out my new schedule and all of that sort of thing. So instead of just going weeks or months even without uploading or just doing like an update video, I decided that this would be the most fun thing to do. And so I hope you guys enjoyed it. I had fun. My voice is a little bit shot because I've been talking for like an hour. But let me know if you like this video, and if you'd be interested, like, I don't know, I could show you my Final Fantasy collection. I could show you my my PSP collection, my DS collection, my Monster Hunter collection. It's actually really big. I got a lot of like figures and art books and all sorts of stuff. I don't know. I've mostly avoided doing this kind of, you know, video because I didn't want to do like very many traditionally YouTube type of videos. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not the type of thing that I was necessarily interested in. But, you know, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to give it a try, and I've really enjoyed it. So yeah, again, let me know if you like it down in the comments below. And also, you know, thank you for bearing with me over what will probably be the next, you know, few weeks as I get used to the new schedule. And, you know, I'll probably, you know, try different types of content. It'll still all be dungeon crawler or, you know, Metroidvania, the types of stuff that I'm already covering. It's going to be those topics still, but, you know, it just might be different, different types of content, different, formats or whatnot, just like this video. So yeah, thank you all for watching. If you happen to make it all the way to the end here, comment down below and let me know what your favorite dungeon crawler is in your physical collection. Or if you don't have any dungeon crawlers, you know, your favorite Souls-like or hardcore RPG, or, you know, whatever your physical collection is, whatever your favorite one in that is, yeah, let me know down below. A special thanks to all of my Patreon and Ko-Fi supporters whose names are on screen right now. That is for sure going to do it for me in this one. I will talk to you all again very soon. Take care for now.